Why do you keep letting him come back? May's voice cut through the morning, a dry, cold clang of her spoon hitting the plate. Emery looked up, her eyes the faded color of cool leftover tea. Because sometimes, people don't come back to be forgiven. They come back to see if they're still terrifying. I remember that morning. The snow was so thick it completely covered the entryway. Robert stood on the porch, his hand gripping the railing. No one opened the door. All that existed was the faint yellow glow of the kitchen light, shimmering against the white blanket. "Are you just going to keep quiet like this?" he demanded. "I am quiet," Emery replied, "because your voice has drowned out my entire life already." I watched from the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding with every icy beat. This wasn't just a conversation between two old people. It was an entire lifetime of silence slowly dissolving. The following night, the sound of a quarrel echoed from the barn. May pulled me close to the window. "What did he say to him?" she whispered. "I don't know," I replied. "I just heard the sound of metal hitting metal, then silence." The house held its breath. The oil lamp flickered, a thin stream of smoke drifted sideways, and the smell of something burnt seeped through the cracks. I heard Emery whisper softly in the darkness, "Tomorrow, I will not bow my head again." And then came the morning when little Anna ran in, breathless. "Mom, the snow is melting!" I looked out onto the porch. The first light of spring touched everything. The rooftop, and the face of the woman who was once terrified, now sitting peacefully with a cup of tea. If you have ever known what it feels like to walk through your own personal winter, please stay. Because this is the story of a home that was once frozen, and of the people who learned to stand straight in the wind without needing rescue. Please subscribe to the channel to hear the full story, The Courage to Remain, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Because sometimes, just a word you leave behind is enough to warm an entire long season. The snow began to fall at dawn. White flakes hovered in the air, swirling before clinging to the car window glass. The road stretched out in white, flanked by old rows of pine trees, and the dry, crisp sound of tires crunching on ice echoed beneath the thin layer of snow. No one spoke. There was only the steady hum of the engine and the faint clouds of my own breath. I sat in the back, watching the farm appear after the final curve. The roof was covered in thick snow, the chimney smoke thin as thread. It had been years since we returned here, a place where everything seemed unchanged, only older, like a faded photograph. When the car stopped, Emery stepped out onto the porch. She greeted us with a thin smile, as if afraid it might break. Her silver-gray coat was dusted with snow, her breath condensed into vapor, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to hold a teacup. I heard the quiet clink of porcelain against metal, a sound so small, only someone who had lived in silence would notice. "Welcome home," she said, her voice shaking like a curtain caught in the wind. Sebastian nodded a greeting, his eyes avoiding hers. I knew he was deliberately keeping his distance from his own memories. The door opened. The wooden house stood still, and the smell of wood ash and damp timber rushed out, carrying with it the feeling of a place that had witnessed things no one wanted to speak of. Inside, everything was in its familiar place. The slanted wedding photo on the wall, the armchair by the fireplace, the unfinished wool scarf Emery often knitted. The windows were blurred with condensation, like eyes that had cried. I touched the glass. It was ice cold. Through it, the outside world was a blanket of white, marked only by a few bird tracks in the snow. May set her suitcase down and sighed softly. "This will be a long season," she said. Her voice was swallowed by the wind, sounding like a warning aimed at no one. I looked over at Emery and saw her quietly tighten her grip on the teacup. In that moment, I realized everyone here was afraid of breaking something they were still trying to hold together. I led Anna into the small room next to the kitchen. The little girl pressed her cheek against the window pane, excited to watch the first snowflakes fall. I smiled, but a different feeling rose up inside me. Not coldness, but a dense, suffocating silence. I made tea, listening to the water rumble as it boiled. Emery still sat at the table, her eyes watching the fire in the hearth. The orange light reflected on her skin, making her face appear pale. She didn't speak, just gently touched the edge of the table, as if checking to see if what she touched was real. Outside, the wind hissed past the porch, the wood creaking softly. Every small sound in this house had its own memory, as if the walls and floors knew how to keep secrets. I recalled the stories Sebastian used to tell, of a childhood spent between long winters, of a father so strict everyone had to whisper. I had never met him, yet his name still hung in the air, heavy as a layer of fog. "What do you think?" Sebastian asked. "It's too quiet," I replied. "It's always been this way here." He spoke, then stood up and opened the window. A rush of cold air poured in. I watched his breath turn to smoke, as indistinct as words left unsaid. In the afternoon, the snow still hadn't stopped. I gathered firewood, stacking it near the hearth. Anna sat playing with a pile of old yarn, her eyes lighting up every time a spark flew. Emery occasionally turned to look, her smile flashing briefly, like a short streak of light on ice. Night descended, a gray-blue sky covering the rooftop. I listened to the clock tick its slow, steady rhythm, as if measuring the distance between us, people sitting at the same table, yet each in their own separate cold. Sebastian was silent. May was silent too. Only Emery occasionally poured more tea, the white steam rising up to her cheekbones, then dissipating as quickly as if it had never existed. I looked around, realizing I was in a space that was both peaceful and so fragile that any noise could shatter it. At the corner of the table, the tea grew cold. I picked up the cup and touched my lips to it. A faint bitterness, exactly like the cold seeping through the cracks in the wood. Outside, the snow continued to fall steadily. I told myself, perhaps the season really will be long. And in that long expanse, the most frightening thing isn't the cold, but the things no one has the courage left to say. The first evening passed as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. All that remained was the sound of cutlery hitting the plates like old metal, dry and brittle. The yellow light from the lamp swayed gently above the dining table, casting flickering shadows that seemed to be trying to hide beneath the wooden surface. No one spoke much. Emery sat at the head of the table, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes tracking Sebastian's small movements, as if she still couldn't quite believe her son had truly returned. May carved the chicken, her movements so careful that you could distinctly hear the knife slide past the soft muscle fibers. Anna sat between Sebastian and me, a tiny spoon in her hand. She stirred her mashed potatoes, then paused, looking around. "Grandma, doesn't this house have music?" The innocent question made me hold my breath slightly. Emery offered a smile, but it was fleeting. "It used to," she said, her voice soft as cold ash. I looked around the room. Dark brown wooden walls, a low ceiling, condensation on the windows. Here, the cold didn't reside in the snow. It lived in the way people looked at each other. Every glance touched and then quickly retreated, as if afraid to leave a mark. Sebastian set his knife down, his back slightly rigid. I realized he was counting his breaths. In this house, he had never truly breathed naturally. I turned and asked him, trying to keep my voice light, "Does your father still come back here?" The air stopped, taut like a stretched canvas. Emery dropped her spoon, the sound small but enough to freeze the kitchen. May looked up, her eyes meeting mine, not with blame or anger, but as if trying to say, "Don't touch a wound that hasn't closed." "Eat, dear," Emery whispered. But her voice had shifted.
It carried the cadence of someone familiar with fear, a fear that didn't come from the dark, but from the familiar. Sebastian remained silent. His shoulders grew heavier, his hands clenched beneath the table. I heard the chair creak, the wind whistling through a crack in the door, the clock ticking steadily, all blending into the silent soundtrack of a house that knew how to swallow quiet. I picked up a piece of vegetable and chewed slowly. A tiny hint of bitterness in my throat made me want to say something more, to break the wall rising between us. But then May replied, her voice so low I had to lean in to hear. Around here, talking too much tends to break what we're trying to hold together. The short sentence dropped the temperature in the room by a few degrees. No one spoke next. The candle on the table wavered gently, the flame shrinking before settling still. I looked out the window. The snow was still falling, slow and steady. A thin layer covered the wooden frame, reflecting the yellow light like the dust of time. The wooden walls around me seemed to be keeping secrets. Every splintered grain was a buried story, every peeling paint chip an unspoken sigh. Emery stood up to collect the dishes. Let me, I offered, but she shook her head. You're a guest, she replied, almost as an apology. I watched her figure, thin, small, her footsteps even and silent. May quietly helped her. They stood by the sink, neither saying a word. There was only the sound of running water and the gentle clink of china, soft, steady, almost deliberately avoiding resonance.
Sebastian cleared the table, and I placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't mean to. He cut me off softly. It's fine. But his voice lacked truth. I saw his gaze linger on the wall where the paint was scorched, then drift to a dark stain in the corner of the kitchen. Did you ever fix that spot? I asked. No, he replied. He told us to leave it, to remember. A cold draft snaked through the floorboards, making the candle flicker again. I felt a slight shiver, not from the cold, but from the feeling that this house was listening to everything. I took Anna up to her room. The wooden staircase groaned under each step, the sound echoing like a slow heartbeat. The little girl asked, Is Grandma sad, Mom? Why do you think that? Because she doesn't look at anyone. I hugged her, stroking her hair. Maybe grown-ups look in a different way. Anna nodded, then fell asleep quickly, as if the snow outside were a lullaby. I returned to the kitchen. Emery was clearing the linens, the yellow light illuminating her hands, which were shaking slightly. I walked over, gently placing the kettle back on the stove. It's going to get colder, I said. Here, winter doesn't end early, she replied. I nodded, asking no more. The kitchen warmed up, yet the distance between the people in it remained cold. I realized that in this place, love hadn't disappeared, it was merely frozen solid, lying dormant behind wood and frost, waiting for someone brave enough to thaw it out. When I turned off the light, the glow from the last embers of the fire shone onto the wall, casting the shadows of 3 women, 3 generations, each carrying their own silence. And I understood. These walls don't just keep secrets. They also hold the breath of those who were once afraid to speak. Outside, the snow was falling harder. I heard the wind sigh over the rooftop, then stop at the window frame, where I could still see my reflection fading in the thin light. I whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear. Perhaps the real cold isn't in the snow after all. I woke up in the middle of the night, not because of a noise, but because of a silence that was too thick. The room was dark, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, falling onto dust motes suspended in the air. I sat up, pulling the wool blanket around me, listening to the wind howl outside the porch, a sound that seemed distant yet touched my ear instantly. As I stepped into the hallway, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. On the shelf near the staircase, a framed photograph was face down, covered in a layer of hazy dust as thick as a memory not allowed to be seen. I reached out and touched it gently, the icy coldness spreading along my fingers. Something about the way that picture was turned over made me understand. In this house, People didn't hide things because they forgot, but because they were afraid to remember. Down the hall, the door to a wooden cabinet was slightly ajar. A small sliver of light escaped the crack, yellow blending with the moonlight. I stepped closer. In the jammed drawer, something bulky was pushing up beneath the lining cloth. A faded yellow color, an envelope, or a piece of forgotten paper. I didn't know. I didn't open it. I simply noted that it was there, like a faint light under a layer of ice. Perhaps in old houses, the past isn't in the stories told, but in the inanimate objects waiting to be named. The wind sneaked through a gap in the floorboards, producing a whistling sound like a sigh. This old house knew how to breathe. Slowly, softly, carrying the echo of years kept captive between the walls and the floor. I stood still, feeling the cold air touch my skin, hearing my own heart beat out of sync with the wind. Someone's footsteps sounded from downstairs. Slow, heavy, as if the person didn't want to be heard but wasn't light enough to hide themselves. I held my breath, my hand lightly gripping the banister. The wooden floorboards creaked, then silence. "Sebastian?" I called out softly, but there was no reply. A shadow briefly flickered downstairs, or maybe it was just the movement of the oil lamp outside the kitchen. I stopped at the last step, looking into the darkness where the light didn't reach. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Emery often said that snow makes people think everything is more peaceful than it really is. But I understood. Peacefulness is sometimes just the way cracks conceal themselves. I went back into the kitchen and lit the oil lamp. The small flame flickered, reflecting on the wall, stretching and distorting my shadow. The smell of burning wood mixed with mildew. I saw a few unwashed dishes still on the table, the tablecloth loosely folded, one corner wrinkled like a grasping hand. I pulled out a chair and sat down, opening the small notebook I carried. The pencil gently touched the paper. I wrote, the first line appearing in slow, steady strokes. Some houses still remember how people hurt. The sentence lay still on the page, but I felt it spreading, like a thin wisp of smoke, finding its way out of the kitchen. I faintly listened for the footsteps again, or was it just imagination? Outside, the wind blew through the pine trees, carrying a long hiss that touched the roof, then vanished. On the shelf, the photograph was still face down. I wanted to turn it over, but then stopped. Some things lose their truth if you look at them too soon. I left it be, only lightly touching the wooden edge with my fingertip. On that cold surface, I felt the rhythm of a memory, faint, but not dead. I put out the lamp. The light retracted, then went out. In the darkness, I distinctly heard the house breathing, the snow falling outside the porch, and somewhere, the footsteps sounded again. Once more, slower, farther away. I closed my eyes, letting my breath merge with that rhythm. Perhaps those weren't the sounds of someone walking. They were just the past returning, trying to step through a door that had never been opened. I woke up again to footsteps in the middle of the night. Not fast, not rushed, just steady and heavy, like someone accustomed to threatening others with silence. The sound moved slowly across the old wooden floor, paused in the hallway, then continued, as if it knew exactly where the floorboards would creak. I sat up, my heart beating in sync with that rhythm. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, creating faint streaks of light on the wall. Everything in this house seemed to possess its own memory, even the sounds. I opened the door to my room. The hallway was long and cold. At the far end, a window was slightly ajar. The wind snaked through, causing a section of the curtain to flutter gently. May sat by the window, her small figure dwarfed by the pale moonlight. She didn't turn around when she heard me. Her hand was tightly squeezing her wrist, as if to suppress something rising inside her. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "No," she said, then fell silent. Her gaze was directed outside, where the snow was falling in thick layers. "If he comes back, don't intervene." I froze. What did you say? If he comes back, don't intervene, she repeated, her eyes dark. In this house, the one who intervenes is usually the one who gets hurt first. I looked at her wrist. The old bruise had faded, but it hadn't disappeared. An indistinct purple-gray color, like the color of fear that is dried up. I started to step closer, but she pulled her hand away. I just want to make sure Anna doesn't see that. She won't see anything, she said, but hearing, that's different. Children hear more than adults think. A strong gust of wind blew through. The curtain billowed out, enveloping her shoulders, then settled down. I realized. The cracks weren't just in the walls, but in the person sitting right in front of me. I poured water and offered it to her. Are you afraid he'll come back? May looked at me with a strange look. Not fear itself, but the look of someone accustomed to being afraid. He never truly left, she replied. It's just that everyone pretended he did. We sat in silence, listening to the wind howl around the rooftop. In the sound of the wind, there was the echo of years of unspoken words. They said that season he left because of gambling and alcohol. No one dared to say it directly. The story passed by like a crack in the wall. Everyone saw it, but pretended not to look. And like all things left unsaid, the story didn't need an ending. It just left a black hole in the roof of the house. Sebastian had told me a few fragmented pieces. Dinners with the sound of breaking plates, falling chairs, the sound of him walking out the door into the snow. And then no one daring to wait anymore. He spoke in a low voice, as if recounting someone else's story. But in his eyes I saw the shadow of the child who once huddled in the corner of the house, listening to the heavy breathing of his father behind the door. I wanted to ask more, but I couldn't. Some questions are best left to the wind. May looked at me, her lips pressed slightly together. Do you ever think people can learn to be silent so well that they forget their own voice? I think so, I replied. But at some point, silence gets tired too. She nodded slightly, then turned away. The candle on the windowsill was abruptly extinguished by the wind. The room grew darker, leaving only the sound of breathing. I distinctly heard both our breaths, short, broken. Neither of us tried to relight the candle. The darkness somehow made us feel safer than the light. A moment later I returned to the room. Along the way I heard the squeak of a hinge. I couldn't tell which door it came from. Perhaps Emery was up early, or perhaps the house was just shifting. Either way, I had the feeling that someone was moving around in the night, as if the past hadn't yet wished to leave. I lay down, trying to find the remaining warmth on my pillow. Sebastian was still fast asleep, his back turned toward me. I looked at the outline of his shoulder, rigid and tall, and then saw the crack within him. Something invisible, yet audible to the heart. I gently touched his back. He flinched slightly, a reflex. I withdrew my hand and lay still. Perhaps that crack couldn't be touched with a hand, only understood through silence. The wind picked up again, bringing with it the creaking of a door. I closed my eyes, listening to the snow sweep across the roof, listening to the slow fade of the footsteps in my memory. Then I whispered to myself, maybe we have all been struck by silence. And in that darkness I realized, the thing that makes people cold isn't the snow, but the memories that have never thawed. Morning broke with a pale white light filtering through the curtains. I sat up, feeling the cold seep into my fingertips, even though the stove still held hot embers. Anna slept deeply, her arm wrapped around her old fabric bear. I pulled the blanket up, gently stroking her hair, but my heart felt heavy. Some children are born into love, and some are only raised by silence. Sometimes, silence is the harshest family legacy. I stood, quietly opening the window. Outside, snow blanketed the porch.
The wind carried the damp scent of wood and earth. The space was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. Downstairs, Emery was making tea, the sound of the spoon stirring even and soft, like a worn-out habit. Everything in this house operated like a ritual, precise, slow, a rhythm no one dared to break. Sebastian was already awake. I heard him pull open the stable door outside, followed by the clang of metal striking metal. Dry, abrupt, cold. I put on a coat and stepped out onto the porch. It wasn't raining, nor sunny. It was just the muted, hazy light of the days preceding a storm. And I knew. The storm was coming.
I just didn't know from which direction. He was standing by the fence, his breath turning to smoke. The brown horse nudged its head against his shoulder, and he stood still, as if that very silence helped him remain unseen. When I approached, he didn't turn his head. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. "Just the wind." "I thought I heard a car." He stopped, his hand tightening momentarily on the saddle. "Must have been the neighbors." His voice was flat, emotionless. In this place, every answer was engineered to shut down a question. We led the horse into the stable. He pulled off his gloves, tossing them onto a shelf. As he bent over, his coat rode up, and I saw them on his back. Long, old, pale marks. Scars ran along his spine, thin and faded, like lines of text someone had written and then desperately tried to erase. I went silent. "Sebastian." He turned, meeting my gaze, then quickly looked away. "Fell off a horse when I was a kid," he said, his voice dry as cold ash. I knew it was a lie. I didn't need proof, only the sight of him pulling himself inward, as if memory could still strike him. I didn't ask further. Some stories, when told, make the speaker die one more time. We worked in the yard until my hands were numb. May brought coffee out, the steam rising sharply in the wind. "Mom says the weather is changing," she said, looking toward the heavy gray clouds gathering on the horizon. "When the snow stops falling, that's usually when the storm begins." Anna ran out, her boots sinking in the snow, giggling. Emery stood in the doorway watching them, her eyes a mix of tenderness and worry. The sight made me want to believe things could be different, but the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. By noon, the sky had deepened to the color of lead. A car engine sounded in the distance, an alien sound in the middle of this snowy season. Everyone turned their heads. Emery set her teacup down, her hand shaking slightly. May took her hand and asked, "Who do you think it is?" "Maybe just a delivery driver," she said, but her voice held no conviction. The sound of the car grew louder, then stopped at the gate. No one got out. Only the wind drew out the silence. I looked at Sebastian. He tightened the strap of his apron and stepped forward. The wooden door screeched as he opened it. A man stood there, in a black coat, his hat pulled low, snow clinging to his shoulders. He said nothing, just looked inside. The distance between them, father and son, had never been greater. I heard Emery take a sharp, breathless intake of air. She stood, then immediately sat down, her eyes fixed on the porch. May bit her lip, silent. Anna tugged at my hand, whispering, "Mom, who is that?" I didn't answer. Sebastian took a step outside. The man gave a slight nod, a smile flickering, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Long time." His voice was hoarse, rough, tainted with the smell of liquor. Sebastian replied, "Not long enough." The air froze solid. The wind snuck in, whipping the curtain by the door, making the candle in the kitchen flicker wildly. Emery stood, trembling like a leaf in the wind, but she did not approach. "Dad," May whispered, her voice fractured. Robert looked at her, his eyes the dull color of steel. "Where's your mother?" She stepped forward, her hands clenched white around her apron. "I'm here." He nodded a faint smirk. Good. Thought you might be dead. I stood in the corner of the kitchen, afraid to breathe. Everything was in slow motion, the wind, the snow, the breaths, and the eyes of people who shared a name, but no longer shared a home. A resounding thud echoed as Sebastian shut the door. All sound from outside was blocked, leaving only the sound of the wind circling the roof. After that, no one spoke. Emery sat down, her hands shaking not from the cold but from something far deeper. May stood leaning against the wall, staring fixedly at the floor. I brought the still hot teacup to Emery. She didn't take it, only whispered, "The storm has arrived." I looked outside. The snow had started falling again, thick and heavy. In the sound of the wind, I clearly heard the car engine start, then move slowly away, dissolving into the white hiss of winter. But that sound didn't leave the house. It was trapped in the walls, in the breath, in the fear that had just returned. When I turned back, Sebastian was sitting down, his hand gripping a glass of water tightly. I touched his shoulder. He didn't look at me, only whispered, "This storm didn't come from the sky." And I understood. Some storms don't need the wind. They only need one person to come back. The fireplace was murmuring that evening, the gold light dancing on the walls. I sat next to Sebastian, silently listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the snow was still falling, thick and fine, like a cloth draped over everything unfinished. No one spoke about his return, but everyone knew. The peace in this house had just been sliced by a small cut. Sebastian took off his coat and sat down, his shoulders heavy. I noticed the scar on the back of his neck, faded like a white thread. The firelight played upon his skin, making it shimmer with a bronze hue, occasionally flashing like metal. I reached out to touch it, wanting only to reassure him, but he flinched slightly, the reflex of someone who had once been hit. I pulled my hand back, my heart sinking. A silence as thick as a wall stood between us. He bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "I was afraid I'd hurt someone." He paused as if searching for an old phrase. I thought yelling was protecting. I didn't know what to say. I looked at his hands, hands that had gripped a horse's reins, that had repaired a roof, yet now trembled slightly like a child's hand caught doing wrong. I spoke softly, my voice low, just loud enough for the fire to hear. "Where I come from, the wind teaches people to stand straight." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "And here, it teaches people to bend their backs." The two sentences lay still between the crackling wood, like two pieces of metal striking each other, small but deeply resonant. I saw shame in his eyes, the kind of emotion that only exists in people who have been hurt, but are afraid to admit their weakness. I quietly asked, "Do you remember the last time you smiled?" He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the fire. "No, but I remember the last time I was silent." "When was that?" "When Mom fell, and he still said, 'Don't be dramatic.'" The air seemed to freeze. The fire blazed, reflecting alternating patches of light and shadow on the walls. I heard Emery upstairs, her footsteps slow, then stopping. Perhaps she heard our conversation, or was merely listening to her own fear. Sebastian rested his hands on his knees, leaning down. "I used to think, if I stayed quiet, everything would be calm. But silence is just like the whip, it just doesn't leave a mark." I wanted to embrace him, but I didn't. Some people, if you touch them too soon, will shatter. I stood up, pouring more tea. The steam rose, a hazy white. I placed the cup in front of him, sat back down, and said nothing. He looked at the tea, then offered a tired smile. When I was little, Mom used to say, "A good man knows how to keep his voice down." Was she wrong? I asked. He shook his head. Not wrong. She just forgot to teach him. A draft whistled through the door crack. The flame wavered slightly. The light illuminated his face, dividing it into two halves, one bright, one dark. Perhaps that was his true form, one half trying to forget, the other still remembering. I looked around the kitchen. Everything seemed smaller at night. The dining table, the wooden chairs, even our voices were quieter. But the silence was no longer as terrifying as before. It felt like the breathing space after pain, where people can clearly hear their own heart still beating. I picked up the old cloth, wiped the stove, and swept up a few pieces of ash that had fallen from the hearth. The sound of the brush on the wood was soft as a sigh. He sat watching, his gaze no longer distant. "Do you think she'll understand?" he asked. "Anna?" "Yeah. Children understand more than we realize. They just don't say it." He nodded, then whispered, "Like her mother." I smiled faintly, so as not to break the delicate atmosphere. We sat quietly, the fire burning steadily. The orange light reflected on the ceiling, forming a warm circle. The scent of tea, smoke, and the snow outside the porch blended into a strange tranquility. I realized that after every storm, people don't necessarily have to speak words of forgiveness. All it takes is a touch that doesn't frighten anyone, for love to begin to take root. I placed my hand on the table, not touching him, just close by. He didn't pull away. Our eyes met in silence. Outside, the wind stopped howling. The fireplace popped with a dry sound, then settled into quiet. Perhaps winter had begun to open its mouth, not with the sound of the wind, but with the first warmth it was willing to leave behind. That afternoon the snow fell so heavily that the road in front of the yard disappeared. The wind swirled, carrying white flakes that flew slantwise, thick as smoke. Emery was rekindling the fire, May was washing dishes, and I was wiping the table. Anna sat by the window, drawing scribbled circles with her breath on the glass. Everything was still, a tranquility as thin as paper, easily ripped by a single noise. Then, the sound of a truck rumbled through the thick snowflakes. A rough, grinding sound mixed with the wind, familiar enough to make Emery drop the ladle she was holding. Everyone in the house looked up, but no one spoke. May stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the window. Sebastian tightened his apron strap, then slowly removed it. I looked at Emery. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Just by looking, I knew that woman was gathering all the courage of her life just to keep from shaking. The engine died. The truck door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a blow to the chest. Wind rushed in through the crack, carrying the smell of gasoline and cold. The door opened, and Robert walked in. Dark coat, broad shoulders, smelling of liquor mixed with smoke. His wool hat was covered in snow, soaked, water dripping onto the wooden floor. His breath was heavy. Every step seemed to push the air out of the room. His shadow filled the kitchen. Emery took half a step back, her hands gripping her apron. May also stood still, her face white. I heard the wall clock press out each tick, slow and heavy. Everyone waited, like actors who knew the predetermined script. Robert looked around, his gaze sweeping the table, the fire, and then stopping on me. In those dull gray eyes there was something both dismissive and curious, as if he were sizing up an intruder rather than a daughter-in-law. He placed his wet leather gloves on the table, his voice rough and deep. "Does the weak woman from out of town intend to discipline my family?" His voice dropped into the kitchen like a stone hitting thin ice. I saw Emery flinch slightly,
and Sebastian took a step back, looking down at the floor. I stood straight, not retreating, not evading. I only teach my daughter not to be afraid. The sentence came out softly, almost a breath, but it struck the silence hard. The room suddenly felt empty, as if everything, light, sound, air, had been sucked out in a flash. Robert gave a slight, dry laugh, devoid of any joy. You think people here are afraid? I don't think, I replied. I see. He curled his lip, taking a step toward me. The wooden floor creaked under his heel. The smell of strong liquor permeated the air, mixed with cigarette smoke. His eyes didn't leave mine, cold, but not entirely angry. It was as if he was measuring where I would break. Sebastian stepped between us,
his voice low but firm. You should go rest. Robert turned to his son, his eyes flashing more with weariness than anger. Are you still letting a woman speak for you? She isn't speaking for me, Sebastian replied. She's only saying what you refuse to hear. A long moment. The wind lashed the window. Snow rushed through the gap, scattering onto the floor. Emery took half a step forward, then stopped. Her eyes met mine. A plea not to push further. Robert glanced around, his gaze stopping on Anna. The little girl was pressed behind my legs, her eyes wide. He paused, lowering his voice. Who is the kid? Your granddaughter, I said. Doesn't look like anyone in this house. Perhaps that's because she hasn't learned fear yet, I replied. No one laughed. No one spoke. There was only the wind whistling over the roof and the wood popping in the hearth. The only sounds proving the world was still alive. Robert took off his coat and draped it over a chair. His shoulders were large and hard, but his movements were heavy, like someone who had carried an entire winter back with him. He poured whiskey into a glass, drank it down, and poured another. He didn't offer any to anyone. Emery cleared the dishes, her hands still shaking. May avoided his gaze, trying to appear normal, but her small hand tapped a chaotic rhythm against the side of the bowl. I sat down, holding Anna in my lap. Robert looked at me, his eyes weighing whether I was a threat or a distraction. How long do you plan to stay? Until the snow melts. The snow doesn't melt quickly here, he said. I have time. This time he was the one who turned away first. He took another gulp of whiskey, sighed. And in that instant, I saw the fatigue in his posture, a man who was once accustomed to controlling everything, now relying only on alcohol to hear himself speak. Sebastian looked at me. No words were needed. Only the look of someone who had just realized the past doesn't die. It only hibernates and knows the way home. Outside, the wind still howled. I heard the truck engine part silently in the yard, like a beast lying in wait. The fire burned steadily, the light casting Robert's shadow long on the wall, reaching all the way to the foot of the stairs. No one spoke further. No one continued eating. The house sank into silence again, the only difference being that this time, the silence had a shape, a breath, and the smell of whiskey. I placed my hand on Anna's back, feeling her heart beat quickly. Across the table, Emery silently watched the fire, tears welling up but not falling. And Robert, still sitting there, his gaze lost, amidst the smoke, the vapor, and the things that were left unrepaired. And I understood. Some people return not to apologize, but only to prove they can still walk into this house unchallenged. I looked out. The snow was still falling, individual flakes, thick, heavy, falling onto the old tire tracks, erasing the traces of the road he had just traveled. In the small kitchen, the fire still burned, and we sat still, waiting for winter to utter its first word. The air in the house was heavy as a block of ice hanging overhead. Every breath turned to vapor, dissolving only to settle back into the paralyzing silence. The fire in the hearth was slowly dying,
the weak gold light barely enough to reflect the faces, silent and weary. In Emery's eyes, I saw the fear of a lifetime. It wasn't just fear of the man sitting across from her, but fear of what he represented. The past. A time when no one was allowed to speak. No one was permitted to weep. Only stark endurance packaged in dinners and arid lessons. Robert still sat at the head of the table, glass in hand, his eyes following the firelight. Every time he drank, Emery's shoulder would flinch. May was washing dishes, but the water from the faucet had stopped. She kept her hands under the imaginary stream, as if needing something between her palms to keep them still.
Sebastian leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the floor, trying to remain detached. But I knew. The scars would never allow him to stay still when the storm returned. I placed the kettle on the stove. The rising heat fogged the window pane. The room was small, sealed, yet the wind still found its way in, snaking through the gaps in the wood, blowing through our hair, carrying the damp scent of years that refused to leave. I thought, the real winter begins when people open their mouths. Robert set his glass down, the faint clink loud enough to stop everyone. He spoke, his voice hoarse, drawn out like a command. This table has too many strangers. I didn't reply. Emery gently bowed her head, her eyes leaving his, fixed firmly on her teacup. May spoke, her voice thin as a thread. No one is a stranger in their own home, Dad. Robert glared at her, the look making her physically recoil. Don't correct me, he said. Not loud, but every word dropped like heavy metal. Outside, the wind lashed violently against the roof. The windows rattled. Anna was sitting on the cold floor, playing with the small cat. She laughed, a light, clear sound. A dissonant note in a house far too accustomed to the sound of wind and terror. Then, suddenly, she slipped and fell on the cold floor. The impact was small, but the sound of hurried footsteps, of breathless gasps, was not. I jumped up and so did Emery. Snow clung to the little girl's skirt, dropping onto the floor as she scrambled up. The light in the kitchen flickered, casting shadows on May's frantic face. It's okay, you just slipped, I said, bending down to comfort Anna. The child's lips were pressed together, her eyes wide with fright. But Robert was already standing. His chair crashed backward with a screech. He walked towards us, his shadow stretching out, blocking all light. The small kitchen suddenly became suffocating. He stopped in front of us, his voice low, heavy and rough, with no need to shout. Get up. Did you hear me? Anna trembled, clinging tightly to my arm. I looked up and saw that his eyes were no longer a grandfather's, but a man's, who believed that fear was a method of teaching. Dad, Sebastian said, stepping forward. Enough is enough. Robert turned to his son, a thin, ragged smile on his face. I just told her to get up. She's 6 years old. Every age needs to learn obedience. Emery drew a sharp breath, her hand placed on her chest as if restraining something about to break. May held her mother's shoulder, gently shaking her head, trying to hold her back. But Emery was the one who pulled away first. No one, Emery's voice rang out, small but clear, touches her anymore. The room fell silent. The wind outside howled long and loud, striking the window like a warning. Robert looked at his wife, his old eyes widening, a flicker of surprise. Then they darkened. What did you say? He asked, his voice lower still. You heard me, she replied. Her hand still trembled, but her eyes did not. In the firelight, Emery's face shone, not with strength, but with the resolve of someone who had been afraid long enough. Robert gave a faint laugh, shaking his head, a bitter smile. I don't know if I came home or walked into someone else's house. Perhaps both, I said, standing up, still holding Anna tightly. Sebastian stepped in, blocking Robert's path. His eyes were no longer evasive. If you intend to discipline anyone, discipline me. Don't teach others using your fear. Robert took a step back. The whiskey glass on the table tipped over, the dark red liquid spilling out, soaking into the wood grain. The smell of alcohol spreading throughout the space. No one picked up the glass. No one cleaned the spill. We just stood there, listening to the wind, listening to the house creak, as if breathing out the accumulated exhaustion of many years. I lifted Anna. She rested her head on my shoulder, still shaking. Emery sat back down, her eyes half closed. May took a cloth and slowly, carefully, wiped the floor, as if afraid every drop of whiskey still held his voice. Sebastian stood in the middle of the room, looking out onto the porch where the snow was falling harder. He whispered, almost to himself, "The storm is here." I didn't answer. In my heart, I thought, the storm arrived long ago. It's only just opened its mouth. And in the fire-lit kitchen, where everyone trembled but no one retreated, I understood. There are moments that don't require a shout, yet are enough to change the course of an entire life. The next morning, the kitchen was saturated with mist. The pale white light streamed through the condensation-covered window, casting damp, sprawling streaks onto the wooden floor. The smell of whiskey was gone, replaced only by the scent of cool leftover tea and residual smoke from the old embers. I heard someone's footsteps coming down the stairs, slow and soft, like a person relearning how to walk inside their own home. Emery walked in, her collar pulled up high, her posture slightly uneven. Her gray wool sweater caught on the edge of the chair. She untangled it with a small, surprisingly patient movement. She said nothing, just scanned the kitchen once, as if checking to see if the world was truly still after a storm. The early light slanted, illuminating a faint, dark mark on her neck, like a bruise that hadn't quite faded. I didn't ask. No one asked. The answer had been sealed in the silence since last night. She poured hot water into the teapot. The steam rose straight up, no longer trembling as it used to. Emery's hands were still thin, but they were no longer evasive. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were teaching herself how to reclaim an act that once belonged to a routine of fear. I sat at the table, quiet. May walked in next, her hair messy, dark circles under her eyes. She stopped at the doorway, looking at her mother. No words, no greeting, just a silent gaze between the two women, one old, one young, connecting, containing decades of fear forced into silence. May moved closer, picked up the spoon, and stirred the tea for her mother. Emery looked down, then up, as if she couldn't quite believe the sight before her. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Yes," May replied softly. "You?" "I did too." Simple replies, but for the first time, I heard their voices without a tremor. Emery placed her hands on the table, her palms calloused from years of domestic work. She smoothed out the crease in the tablecloth, adjusting the teacup until it was straight. The steam blurred her glasses, half submerging her face in the light. I looked at her, daring not to voice my thought, that perhaps people truly grow up only when they stop being afraid of their own voice. Emery lifted the teacup and took a gentle breath. "It's brighter today," she said, almost smiling. "Yes," I replied. "The light is different now." She nodded. Then Emery quietly said, "It is now." No one fully understood the sentence, but everyone knew its meaning. She set the teacup down, the sound a light but firm click, like a silent vow. Outside, the sun was weak, reflecting on her cheekbones. The light emphasized the lines around her mouth, yet it didn't make her look frail. On the contrary, her eyes no longer avoided mine. They looked straight, deep, as if re-examining the entire house, her entire life. I heard May swallow, as if afraid of shattering the fragile atmosphere. Emery smiled, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Make some more tea, dear. This house hasn't had a morning warm enough in a long time. May complied, silently, but a hint of a smile flickered on her lips. A smile not necessarily of joy, but of being able to finally breathe together. Sebastian walked in, his hair wet, his shirt damp with melted snow. He stopped at the door, surprised by the scene. 3 women standing together in the same light. No one spoke, but the look exchanged between them said everything. He sat down, quietly taking off his gloves and placing them on the table. Emery looked at him, not with the gaze of a frightened mother, but of someone who had just stepped out of the shadow. Did he leave? She asked. Yes, Sebastian replied. Did he say anything? No. That's good then, she said, taking a sip of tea, her voice steady. What people say is no longer as important as what we choose to keep. I realized the old kitchen seemed larger than usual. Perhaps it was the light, or perhaps the fear had been put away. On the wall, the face-down photo frame from last night was still there, but someone had wiped the dust clean. I stood up and slightly opened the window. A rush of cold air poured in, touched my face, then dissipated. Emery didn't tell me to close it as she usually would. She just looked outside, where the snow reflected the light into thousands of sparkling rays. Anna woke up and ran down the stairs. She didn't fully understand what had happened, only that everyone was sitting together, which made her happy. She climbed onto the chair and hugged Emery's arm tightly. Grandma, it's bright today. Emery replied softly. Yes, I see it. Are you scared anymore? She leaned down, touching her nose to her granddaughter's forehead, her voice light as a breath. No, I'm not scared anymore. I turned away, but my eyes were stinging. The oil lamp still burned in the corner of the kitchen, its orange light flickering gently. Yesterday that flame witnessed a storm. Today it stood still, unwavering. I poured more tea and handed it to Emery. She took it, offering no thanks, only a gentle nod. A small gesture, yet containing a newly formed trust. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. A thin stream of light pierced the window frame, fell onto the table and slowly spread to her hand. Emery set the teacup down, her palm open, like someone ready to receive something that had just fallen. The kitchen was still. No one was hiding their breath anymore, and in that moment I realized the faint light of the early morning is enough to call it dawn if people dare to look up. The afternoon was still. The last light of the day covered the snow in a pale, warm yellow, almost impossibly gentle for winter. I stood outside on the porch, listening to the small drips of melting snow from the rooftop, each drop hitting the wooden gutter with a steady, rhythmic beat, like a quiet breath. Inside, Emery was folding dry towels. She no longer pulled her collar up high, nor did she bow her head when walking past anyone. She simply worked, softly and evenly, as if her body had become accustomed to existing naturally. When I stepped in, she was pouring tea and spoke with an odd serenity. The snow is beautiful when no one is afraid of it anymore. I paused. The sentence resonated like a monologue from the house itself. Her voice was calm, but every word dropped like stones shattering an old chain. It wasn't a declaration, but the inevitable outcome of a lifetime of endurance finally unlatched. Emery sat down, holding the teacup with both hands. On the tabletop, the light shining through the thin curtain spread into a warm rectangle. I looked around. The walls were still the walls. The floorboards still creaked. But something in the house had fundamentally changed. I realized the winter in this house was melting, not because of the weather, but because a woman's eyes had finally found herself. May sat on the doorstep, sewing her mother's wool sweater. Each stitch she made through the fabric felt like a way of stitching time back together. Sebastian brought firewood in, stacking it by the hearth, quietly observing his mother. No one prompted him, but he nodded a greeting to her,
A small, simple gesture, yet filled with a newfound respect. Emery smiled, saying nothing. Outside, the sky slowly shifted to a deep indigo. The wind blew softly, no longer carrying the bite of cold.
I stood watching them, the three of them, like three bass notes in the same piece of music that had just rediscovered their rhythm. As night fell, only the fire in the hearth kept the room adequately warm. Later, it was just Emery and me sitting by the stove. The oil lamp was weak, smoke rising in rings, blurring then dissolving into the low wooden ceiling. Our shadows danced faintly on the wall. She sat opposite me, draped in her old wool shawl. The small space was so quiet we could hear the wood popping in the hearth like quiet whispers. The scent of chamomile tea spread, mixing with the smell of smoke. "Are you tired?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "No, just light." "Light?" "Yes. All my life I thought I needed to be strong. Turns out I just needed to stop being afraid." I looked at her hands. Short fingernails, calloused fingertips. Small details that told more than any words. The lamplight touched the wrinkles around her eyes, not aging her, but making her look more authentic, like someone who had just stepped out of deep snow. I hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "I read your letter." Emery looked up, then down again. She nodded gently without looking up, her thin hands gripping the teacup tightly. "I wrote it for someone who would understand," she said, her voice low, raspy like an old breeze. "I understand." "No, you only feel it," she smiled. "To understand requires living through more." I stayed silent, unsure what else to say. After a long moment, she continued, "Back then, I thought love meant endurance. I believed if I stayed quiet, his anger would lessen. If I bowed my back, the wind would blow over without breaking me. But I was wrong. The wind doesn't care, it just moves. And you just get smaller." She paused, taking a deep breath. "You know, when I said it is now, it wasn't because I won. It was because I no longer wanted to lose." The oil lamp flickered gently. The light shone on her face, making the edges of her eyes glisten. I realized the light wasn't just coming from the lamp, but from her. We sat like that for a long time. No need for more words. Some nights are not for talking, but just for quiet. I looked at the flame, remembering the first days I arrived here, the cold house, the dead stove, people communicating through silence, and every breath afraid to be out of sync. Now, it was the same place, the same firelight, but without the shiver. Emery set the teacup down. "I used to wish someone would speak for me," she whispered. "But yesterday, when I spoke, I realized no one needed to speak for me anymore. I just needed to believe my own voice was loud enough to be heard." I nodded, looking at her for a long time. "You did something many people dare not do their whole lives." She smiled. "I'm not brave. I'm just too tired to be afraid anymore." The wind outside the porch blew gently, slipping through the door crack, but there was no longer a howl. It was just a soft, steady sound, like a greeting from the new season approaching. I added more oil to the lamp. The flame brightened slightly. She watched, quietly saying, "Keep it burning. A weak light is still light." I smiled. "Yes, and it's enough to see each other." She nodded, closing her eyes. Her breathing was slow, steady. Her shadow and mine still stretched long on the wall, but this time it no longer shook. Outside, the snow fell silently, fine as the sigh of winter letting go. And I knew this lamp would not go out, even if the storm returned. The morning was strangely quiet.
There was no longer the sound of the truck, no sound of a man's footsteps, only the wind slipping through the old wooden cracks. The snow outside was thick, blindingly white. Yet, inside, the light felt softer, the exhausted, clear light of an aftermath. I woke early and stoked the stove. The fire flickered, then stabilized, a blue smoke rising straight up, branding the air with warmth. Emery sat in the corner of the table, without her shawl.
Her hair falling naturally, a few gray strands resting on the shoulder of her sweater. Her face seemed to blend into the pale gray light. She didn't look at me, only spoke, her voice quietly raspy, like steam hitting a boiling pot. I was afraid. A silence followed. So afraid I forgot who I was. Her voice was trembling, small, but as genuine as red embers in the ashes. Each word escaped her mouth like something that had waited decades to be uttered. Listening to her, my throat tightened. I pulled a chair and sat opposite her. I didn't intend to comfort her, nor did I know how. I simply sat. After a moment I said, "I don't want my daughter to learn to survive that way." Outside, the wind whistled through the door crack, cold gusts sweeping across, making the fire in the stove waver, reflecting in her eyes. Eyes that were growing cloudy yet deep, as if containing the whole house. I looked at her, continuing in a lower voice. "I wasn't born to change you, but I can bury this fear with you." Emery looked up, meeting my gaze. Her cloudy eyes suddenly glistened, not with overflowing tears, but with light rising from a place that had been dry for too long. She pressed her lips together, trying to remain composed, but small tremors still appeared on her cheekbones. She didn't cry out loud, just tilted her head, the light shimmering in the corners of her eyes. After a moment, she quietly said, "I used to think I was doing right, holding the house together, holding my husband, holding my son. But the more I held, the more I lost." I asked, "What do you think now?" "That no one truly loses by speaking the truth. You only lose when you are silent." I looked at the fire. It burned steadily, the orange light cast on the ceiling, drawing trembling rings. Emery gently placed her hand on the table, her hand resting close to mine, the distance only the warmth of a breath. The kitchen suddenly felt warmer, not because of the fire, but because two women sat close, acknowledging their fears. I thought of my own mother, who was also silent, also afraid, only she never managed to find her voice again. I thought, if I could, I wouldn't let that repeat here. "Sometimes," Emery continued, "I thought I'd forgotten how to love, not because the affection was gone, but because I was afraid love would hurt others." I quietly replied, "Perhaps true love doesn't hurt. It only hurts when people try to hold on to it with power." She looked at me, then smiled. "You speak like someone who has known both." "I'm just learning." She nodded. The light hit the tabletop, shining through the still steaming teacup, creating a pale halo, an awkward crown of light. We sat in silence, with only the small pops of the wood, the smell of smoke blended with tea. Outside, the wind gradually softened. Anna giggled somewhere upstairs, her laugh frail as a string of glass beads clinking together. I looked at Emery. She was sitting straighter than usual, her back no longer curved by the habit of avoidance. Her arms were relaxed, her shoulders slumped, yet her face held a light. Perhaps she was still afraid, but that fear now had a form, a place to be put down. Emery quietly said, "Perhaps I'll rewrite that letter." "Which letter?" I asked. "The one I never sent. Maybe this time I'll write it to myself." I smiled. "If you do that, I'll write with you." The room was quiet again. The oil lamp still burned, the light trembling on the tabletop like a steady breath. Emery looked toward the window, where the white light of the snow reflected inward. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's strange. I'm no longer afraid of this house." I nodded, saying nothing. I understood the feeling. When fear is exhausted, with nowhere left to hide, only the truth remains. And the truth is sometimes gentle. Outside, the ice on the roof was beginning to melt. The sound was faint but clear. A drop of water fell, a tiny sound, yet enough to herald a new season approaching. I looked at Emery, then at the window. The light was weak, but different. The wind no longer howled. The cold was now just a slight ripple on the skin. We didn't need to say more. Winter hadn't left, but I knew. The house had started breathing again. The days that followed were strangely still. The snow was still thick, but the light had changed. It was no longer blindingly white, but carried a faint yellow tint, like warmth trying to seep through the ice. Everyone in the house lived quietly, cautiously, as if the peace they had just won could dissolve with a single loud noise. Then, Robert fell asleep in the old armchair, his boots still on. The room faintly smelled of old liquor. He returned without announcement, as if he had never left. No one asked. No one dared to mention it. His presence, wordless, was enough to shift the breathing rhythm of the entire house. The first morning, he walked into the kitchen, took a glass of water, drank it, and said, 7 o'clock, not early, not late. No one asked what he was referring to, but by 7 that evening, the whole family was present. Dinner proceeded in silence. No one touched their silverware before him. When he cut the first piece of meat, the knife hitting the plate sounded even, like a marching drum. Every small sound made others straighten their backs, as if everyone were living to the rhythm of a single man. Emery still sat opposite him, but her eyes were different. She didn't bow, didn't evade, only looked straight through him, briefly and coldly, like looking at the past. Robert noticed, but didn't react. He ate, drank, wiped his mouth, then stood up. "I need to talk to Sebastian," he said, his voice calm but rigid. I looked at Sebastian. He didn't reply, just put his knife down and stood up. No one intervened. I wanted to, but Emery's eyes signaled, "Don't." Outside, the sky was pitch black. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying the sound of clanking metal. He called Sebastian out to the barn late at night for a man's talk. I stood by the window listening. From a distance, the sound of iron striking iron, then silence. No yelling, no noise, only the cold sound of metal dropping onto the floor, echoing like something broken. I saw Emery standing behind me in the dark. She didn't speak, just lightly touched my shoulder as if to say, "We've been through this." But in her breath, I could hear her exhaustion. A moment later, Robert returned, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look at anyone, just walked past, grabbed the bottle of whiskey from the shelf, and went straight upstairs. Sebastian returned afterward, his shirt dusted with melting snow and mud, a scratch on his hand. He sat down on the chair, silent. I asked, "Are you okay?" He only replied, "I'm fine." Then he bowed his head, his hands clasped together. No one asked further. Some conversations between a father and son have no words, only wounds. Emery washed the dishes longer than usual, her fingers wrinkled like dry leaves. The hot water gradually cooled, the white steam dissipating into the air. Every time she stacked a cup, the faint clink echoed, steady and repetitive, like a silent prayer. May sat by the table, sewing up a tear in her brother's coat. I saw her eyes were red, but no tears fell. The entire house sank back into the old rhythm, a rhythm no one taught but everyone knew by heart. I couldn't sleep that night. I heard the wind, the snow sliding off the roof, and Emery's slow footsteps in the hallway. I went downstairs to the kitchen and saw her sitting by the stove, the small oil lamp illuminating a part of her face. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "No," she replied. "Every time he returns, the house seems to stop breathing." "But you don't." She offered a faint smile. "I just breathe a little quieter so the wind doesn't hear me." I poured tea and handed it to her. The heat spread through my palm, warming me to the bone. "He still believes he is right," I said. "Yes," she nodded. "That's how he survives. People like that don't change. They just get weaker." After a long moment, she asked, "Are you afraid?" "I was afraid," I replied, "but fear doesn't help me protect anyone." She was silent, then quietly said, "I used to think that too. It's just that by the time I realized it, I had forgotten my voice." I placed my hand on the table near hers. "You can reclaim it now." She looked at me, her smile faint, almost weary yet powerful. "Perhaps. But there are rules in this house, rules no one speaks, yet everyone hears." "Then we will learn not to listen anymore," I replied. The fire sputtered, casting light onto the stained wall. From outside, the sound of water dripping from the roof, steady, slow, like a sign of something melting. I stood up and slightly opened the window. The rush of cold air poured in, carrying the scent of melting snow, damp wood, and a faint smell of liquor from upstairs. Robert was still there, still present in every breath, like a darkness refusing to leave. Emery looked outside, her voice so low I had to lean in to hear. "The rules in this house aren't in the words. They are in the fear. But fear can also die if we stop feeding it." I looked at her. Her gray eyes glistened in the firelight, moist but steady. "Then we will kill it," I said. She nodded, not replying, only raising her hand to shield the lamplight. A small gesture, but I understood. She was waiting for the morning. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Inside the house, the fire still burned. And for the first time, I felt the unwritten rules of this house begin to crack, little by little, under the warmth of the people who had stopped bowing their heads. The morning arrived slowly. The light outside the window was pale, like a memory not yet ready to return. May sat on a chair, carefully taping colored paper onto the window pane for Anna. She cut small square pieces, pale blue, yellow, and red, and placed them unevenly so that when the sunlight shone through, it would form shimmering patches of color. "To let more light into the house," she said, her voice light as a breeze. Anna nodded, her eyes bright, stirring watercolor paint with her fingertip. Blue paint smeared onto her cheek, spreading, like a tiny streak of sky on her skin. I stood nearby, watching the window frame change color. The light, when filtered through the paper, became gentle, no longer harsh like before. In this house, everything seemed to be learning how to soften. Voices, footsteps, even fear was shrinking so that people could breathe. But I could still feel the tautness, thin as a violin string pulled across the air, silent, but ready to snap with one strong breath. I hadn't slept the night before. I counted my breaths before drifting off. Each one felt like drawing winter into my lungs. The cold air seeped through the curtain, touched my neck, leaving a sharp, stinging sensation, but not quite pain. It was like memory. It always returns, even uninvited. Downstairs, I heard the sound of a chair being pulled out. the slight clinking of a glass. Robert was up early. He walked slowly, somewhat heavily, but still with the posture of a man accustomed to command. When I entered the kitchen, he was already there. Robert was rearranging the dining table, each movement precise, careful. He pulled the chair at the head of the table close to his chest, placing his large calloused hands on the wooden surface. "A dining table should have order," he said without looking at anyone. No one replied. Emery stood at the stove, stirring the porridge, her eyes fixed on the fire. May bent down to help Anna clean up her toys, her hands trembling slightly. I poured coffee, the small sound intended as a reminder that the world still had room for gentle noise. Robert sat quietly for a moment, then glanced around. "What's with the morning music?" Before I could open my mouth, he continued, "No music in the morning. The sound of the crows is enough." His voice was even, not raised, but something in the way he spoke made the air freeze. May paused mid-movement, still holding the piece of colored paper. Anna looked up, her eyes bewildered. I spoke, calmly. "She just likes a little bit. Music helps her learn faster." Robert sipped his coffee, not replying. He only looked out the window, where the snow in the yard had begun to melt in patches. The light reflected on his glass, glinting like a blade. The room was submerged in silence. Only the sound of the knife cutting bread and Emery's tired breathing. No one wanted to spill even one more drop of sound into the already full atmosphere. After breakfast, he went out onto the porch. His dark coat was covered in a fine dust of snow. I watched through the window, seeing him sitting there, a large old figure, silently isolated in the white vastness. He no longer resembled the man who once threatened everyone with his voice. Now he looked like a cold, heavy stone, unsure where to drop. Sebastian walked across the yard, starting to say something but stopping himself. His eyes no longer held anger, only a hard-to-name kind of pity. He bowed his head and walked on. Inside the house, Emery slowly cleared the table. She wiped the table, rearranged the chairs as usual. But when she reached the chair at the head of the table, she paused. Her hand hovered over the backrest, her gaze lingering. Finally, she didn't wipe it. She just placed her hand on the wooden surface, as if touching an unnameable memory. I walked over, saying nothing. Emery quietly said, "Some men think they are the center, until they have no one left to orbit them." I whispered, "Do you hate him?" She shook her head. "No, I just pity the human part of him. The part that has slept for too long." May brought in more firewood. "Mom, can I put on some music?" Emery turned back, her eyes gentle. "Put it on, but keep it low." May smiled, turning on the old radio. A faint sound filled the room. An old country song, the female singer's voice soft and warm. Robert looked in from the porch. He didn't say anything, only turned away. But I clearly saw his shoulders stiffen, then relax after a single breath. The house suddenly found a different rhythm. The music blended with the sound of boiling water, the tapping of Anna's pencil on the table. No one spoke, but everyone sensed the change. In the afternoon, the snow stopped. The last light of the day poured in through the colored paper May had taped up that morning. The whole room was washed in color, blue, yellow, red, as if someone had just painted warmth with their bare hands. Robert was still sitting on the porch. The sun reflected on the glass in his hand. I didn't know what he was thinking, only saw that large hand gently squeeze the glass, then release it. A single drop of water fell to the ground, spreading into the snow, small but visible. Emery stood behind the curtain, watching her husband, her voice low, almost to herself. "Sometimes The last man standing in the house is not the strongest, but the one who is the last to dare to learn silence. I didn't reply. The light on the wall trembled, changing color with every passing breeze. In that silence, I thought, perhaps, everyone was learning how to find peace in their own house, after years of knowing only fear. And somewhere in the soft music, I heard a new breath, light, steady, as if the house had finally found its heart again. That afternoon, the cold wind swept across the yard, slipping through every wooden crack, carrying the scent of old liquor and smoke. The late afternoon light slanted over the porch roof, drawing a long line on the snow, like a border between the old and the new. Robert sat on the porch, his dark coat covered in a thin dusting of snow. He didn't speak, only gazed distantly toward the forest, where the sunset was slowly retreating. Inside, the house was quiet. Emery finished folding the stack of towels, placing them neatly on the table. She paused, her hand gently squeezing the edge of the fabric, then released it. I knew she was contemplating something that had waited too long to be said. She turned to me, her voice small, yet oddly composed. "I'm going out for a moment." I simply nodded. No need to ask where. Emery walked out onto the porch and spoke to him. "You are no longer the master here." Her voice was low, without a tremor. The sentence fell lightly but struck the air forcefully. Robert turned, his cloudy gray eyes widening for a moment, then narrowing. "You dare to say that to me?" She stood straight, her hands still in her pockets. The light reflecting from inside the house illuminated the outline of her coat, like a weak but enduring flame. I said that to myself first. In that moment, time seemed to halt. The wind stopped at the edge of the porch. The falling snow sounded soft as ash. I watched from inside, seeing the two of them standing less than an arm's length apart, yet they seemed like two different seasons. Robert was silent. He looked at her for a long time, and in that gaze there was not only anger but something resembling exhaustion. Tiredness from having to cling to a role no one believed in anymore. Inside, Sebastian stood in the doorway silent. He stepped halfway out, his shadow partially blocking the wind. His eyes were directed straight at his father. He was no longer evading. Robert looked across, his chin twitching slightly. I saw a fleeting look in him, bewilderment, then wounded pride, then retraction, like someone who had just touched his own past. Emery remained still. "This house doesn't need a master," she said quietly. "It just needs peace." Robert gave a dry, short laugh without humor. "Peace? You think you know what peace is?" "I know," she replied, "because I've lived my whole life in the noise of someone else." The wind blew hard. The pieces of colored paper on the window pane rattled slightly, casting small spots of light onto the yard. Robert looked past her shoulder, seeing the rest of the family behind, May, Anna, and me, all standing there silent, yet breathing to the same rhythm. For the first time I saw him take a step back, very small, but enough to crack the snow beneath his boots. Sebastian spoke, his voice low. "Dad, let everything be quiet now." Robert turned to his son. "You think quiet means what? Letting everyone forget me?" "No," Sebastian replied. "It means letting everyone breathe." That sentence stopped Robert. He looked at his son, then at Emery, his gaze moving slowly like a man tracing a path in the darkness. Then he sat down on the old wooden chair. The chair groaned. His large old hand tensed up, then relaxed. In that moment, I didn't know if he was restraining himself or letting go. Snowflakes clung to his hair, melting slowly. A drop fell onto his coat shoulder, soaking into the fabric, disappearing without a trace. Emery remained standing, neither advancing nor retreating. "You can stay," she said, her voice low, "but not to command. Stay as a person, that's all." Robert didn't reply. He looked at his hands, at the prominent knuckles, the hands that had once gripped a hammer, now only knowing how to grasp air. Sebastian took another step, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, we don't need winning or losing anymore." Robert didn't look at his son, only nodded slightly. The gesture was so small that if I hadn't been standing close, I would have thought he was still silent. Emery turned and walked into the house. The light from the porch illuminated her face, her eyes moist but bright. I heard her say softly as she walked past, "Peace doesn't mean weakness." Robert sat there for a very long time. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of smoke and damp grass. In the twilight,
He no longer looked as large as before. Just an old man sitting alone in the middle of winter, listening to the sound of his own breathing. I stood watching from the window frame, feeling a softness settle within me too. Perhaps the hardest thing for those who are used to control is learning how to be quiet. And the bravest thing is to sit still when no one is afraid of you anymore. Outside, the sky grew darker. Snow began to fall again, dusting Robert's shoulders, the porch roof, melting slowly. Inside, Emery rekindled the stove, the golden firelight casting onto the ceiling, steady, small, yet bright. And I thought, perhaps, this is the image of the last man, not the strongest, but the one who finally agrees to sit in silence, allowing the light to pass through him. The morning settled heavily. It was no longer snowing, but the air was still thick with cold. Robert sat alone in the yard. The ground was blanketed in white. The wind blew across the porch roof, carrying small particles of ice that fell onto his coat shoulder. His beard was frosted, his eyes sunken. His breath was heavy, the wind lashed against the porch eaves. From the window, I could see his silhouette, silent, large, yet weary. Something about this man made the entire scene pause. The cold surrounding him wasn't just the weather. It was the isolation of someone who had no one left to talk to. Robert held a cold coffee cup, the steam long gone. His hand trembled slightly. He glanced toward the house, where the laughter of the little girl echoed. The laughter spread through the curtain, thin as a thread, yet enough to stir the space between two worlds, inside and out. The yellow lamplight shone through the curtain, flickering gently. In the kitchen, Emery was teaching Anna how to fold paper. May was slicing bread. Sebastian was adding wood to the fire. I sat by the window, mending a handkerchief. Everyone was busy. Everything was small, but peaceful. Robert looked across, his face relaxing slightly. Not quite regret, just emptiness. The emptiness of a man who just realized he no longer had a place among his own kin. He touched his chest, where warmth once resided, but now only cold remained. A man who was once large was now lost in the white expanse. I saw his shoulders sag. The wind wrapped around him, dusting his hair and beard with ice. He sat still for a long, long time, as if waiting for something to happen. A word, a hand, or just the sound of someone calling his name. But nothing came. Inside the house, Emery chuckled softly. Anna had just spilled flour on the table, creating a small white cloud that floated up. "Look," May said, "snow inside the house." Everyone laughed. The sound carried outside, thin but clear. Robert still watched. His old eyes followed the light cast through the window, where 3 generations sat together. For the first time, he didn't see chaos. He saw order, a new order that didn't require him. His face softened a little,
Not quite regret, just a moment of emptiness, as if he had just realized the world had moved on while he had stood still for too long. A strong gust of wind blew, tossing a few ice shards into the air. He gently closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The white vapor of his breath dispersed quickly. Then he stood up, bowed his head, and walked away in the snow. His steps were slow, heavy. His old leather boots sank into the white ground, leaving deep, even tracks, like the rhythm of a tired heart. No looking back, no goodbyes. I stood behind the curtain watching him go, unsure if I should open the door. But Emery gently placed a hand on my shoulder, shaking her head. "Let him go," she said. Her voice held no anger, no pity, only acceptance. Outside, Robert stood in the middle of the yard, the deep snow up to his ankles. His wet hair was covered in ice, his beard dotted with white. He looked at the house, the dim light shining through the window, where 3 generations were sitting together.
His eyes lingered there, long, as if wanting to engrave something before letting go. The light reflected on his face, exposing everything: weariness, loneliness, and a silence that was almost peace. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps regret. Or perhaps just a man counting how many breaths he had left. His shoulders sagged slightly. His hands hung loose. He bowed his head and walked away in the snow, his figure heavy, solitary. No one called out. No one sent him off. Only the sound of the snow crunching under his feet, gradually fading until it was gone. I still stood there, listening to the wind, the rattling of the door, and Emery's steady breathing. Inside the house, the lamp still burned, small, warm. His shadow dissolved into the white wind, leaving behind a home that was slowly warming up. A door inside me quietly closed. There was no sound of slamming, only a profound silence. I knew that people like Robert don't truly disappear. They just leave the room where they are no longer needed. Emery sat back down, the lamplight shining on her eyes, making them glisten. "The season was long indeed," she said. I replied, "But at least it's melting." Outside, the snow continued to fall, softly and steadily. And I realized, sometimes, a departure isn't a loss. It's the only way the house can breathe. The morning broke with a profound, stark silence. Snow covered the yard. The forest in the distance was blurred, only faint graphite lines remaining. Through the kitchen window I saw deep footprints in the snow, stretching into a long trail toward the road that vanished in the wind. His silhouette grew smaller, then disappeared into the white. No calling out, no blessing of peace, only the falling snowflakes filling the space behind him. No conclusion was spoken, only the end of an era. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cold window frame. I watched him go. Inside my chest, my heartbeat slowed, as if having just crested a steep hill. In my heart, the anger was gone, replaced only by pity for a man who never knew how to love. A pity that offered no warmth, but at least it no longer clawed at me. Emery walked past behind me, placing the kettle on the stove. The steam rose straight up, like a small column of light in the still dim kitchen. She didn't ask. I didn't explain. We just stood there, looking in the same direction, each putting away a piece of the night before near the glowing fire. By noon, the snow was still falling gently, like dust drifting past the blackbirds perched on the fence. Robert didn't come inside all day, only sat on the porch watching the snow. From where I stood, I could see half of his face turned outward, his posture slightly slumped as if trying to hear something from afar. The gaze was long, like a road no one wanted to travel again. May tied up the curtain to prevent drafts. Sebastian quietly replaced his hammer, wedging a piece of wood into the loose step. Each strike of the hammer was deep, firm, and without anger, as if resetting a shattered rhythm. Anna sat on the floor, arranging her stuffed animals in a row, counting without needing to remember the numbers. "Mom, can we bake later?" the child asked. "We will bake after the snow eases," I said. "Okay," she replied, then tilted her head, listening to the wind as if it were a wordless song. Emery carried a cup of tea out to the porch, placing it beside Robert. He didn't look at her, only nodded very slightly. She came back in, placed a hand on her heart, took a long breath, and continued washing the dishes. Those small mundane movements now carried a strange weight, like a bridge being tested after a storm. In the afternoon the wind died down. The snow stopped falling, revealing patches of grayish-blue sky. The yard shimmered with silver light, resembling a frozen lake. From the porch, Robert called in, "Has anyone seen my lighter?" No one answered. His voice dissolved in the house, like a stone dropped onto deep snow, soundless. I brought out bread, placing it on the table. May turned on the radio. The music was soft, warm, rustic country tunes. Emery looked over but didn't turn it off. She only adjusted the volume lower, audible enough without forcing anyone to listen. Late that afternoon, he tried calling Anna out to the barn, to see the calves. His voice was hoarse, not sharp, as if trying to adapt to another language. Anna looked up, glanced at me, then huddled close. The child hid behind my back. "It's warmer here." Robert froze at the doorway, the hand gripping his hat brim lowered, then released. There was no one to salvage the words that had just fallen into the cold space. He turned away, returned to his rocking chair, and looked into the distance. His broad shoulders shrank. The early afternoon snowflakes that clung to his hair melted and dried, leaving white spots like sea salt on the dark fabric. Sebastian finished fixing the steps, washed his hands, dried them, then stood quietly by the door. He watched his father for a long time, no longer demanding an apology, nor needing a correctly named dialogue. Just the look of a man who had aged in places no one could see, now learning how to stand tall. "Are you all right?" I asked. He nodded. "I will be. And him?" Sebastian looked out onto the porch. "He'll be fine in his own way, too. Just not here." In the kitchen, Emery hung the towel near the stove to dry completely. She poured tea into a small cup, placing it exactly where Robert used to sit every morning, like a leftover habit from the old days. Then she picked the cup up, moving it to another spot. A small change, but enough for the house to understand. The old seat was no longer a throne. I sat down beside the oil lamp. The flame flickered blue, then settled back to amber, steady as a heartbeat. I wrote fragmented sentences in my thin notebook, not forming paragraphs. The ice cracks silently.
A house learns to be quiet. The last man remains with his shadow. Near dusk, Robert stood up, circling the yard as if remeasuring the boundaries that belonged to him. He touched an old wooden post, rubbing a worn spot, then recoiled his hand. I understood the small truth. Memory, once frozen, is cold to the touch. "Do you want dinner, Dad?" Sebastian asked, his voice even. Robert pondered for a moment. "I'll stay out here." "As you wish," he said, without emphasis. No longer pleading or challenging, just acceptance. May carried out a bowl of hot soup, placing it on the porch step. "To warm your hands," she said. Robert nodded, not looking her in the eye, but he lifted the bowl, holding it longer than necessary, as if borrowing the lingering warmth. When the sun went down, the wind returned. The colored paper on the window pane trembled softly, casting blue and yellow light onto the wall. Emery looked at those bright patches and said, "It looks like the ice is singing." Anna giggled, tilting her head to listen. Robert set the bowl down, leaning back, his eyes closed. I didn't know if he was sleeping or just tired. From here he no longer looked large.
Whether it was the snow or time that did this, I wasn't sure. I only knew that the silence around him no longer threatened anyone. When I drew the curtain, the kitchen narrowed into a warm frame, the fire crackling, the scent of tea spreading gently, the distant radio music. In one corner, Sebastian repaired an old lock. In another, May taught Anna to write the letter A on a white sheet of paper. Emery mended the edge of her sweater, her stitches small and firm. These actions, pieced together, formed a new life. Quiet, unannounced, but ordered and full of breath. Night descended. The temperature dropped a few more degrees. On the roof, the ice cracked very softly, like the sound of someone sighing. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small oil lamp in the corner.
The amber light intertwined on the wooden ceiling, slow and gentle. Outside, the white yard stretched out. Robert's footprints were half covered by fine snow. Tomorrow they would be fainter. The day after, they would disappear. But the memory of an afternoon when he sat quietly on the porch, looking into a house where he no longer found himself, that memory would remain, like a crack in the ice visible only when the sun angles just right. I closed the door, hearing the wooden bolt slide into place. Not to lock anyone out, but to keep the warmth in. And deep down in my chest I knew, from now on, all doors would close differently, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The morning began with the faint smell of tea, the scent of liquor gone. On the wooden table, the glass kettle shimmered with condensation. Emery carefully poured a full cup, pushed it toward Robert, and then stopped mid-motion. She changed her mind, setting the teacup down out of his reach. No explanation, no eye contact. Just a silent action, like an invisible boundary line drawn after too many years of blur. Robert sat opposite her, the morning light slicing through the curtain, cutting his face into two halves, light and dark. He didn't ask, nor did he reach for the tea. He just stared intently at the rising steam, as if searching within it for a reason to speak. But he remained silent. He merely sniffed lightly, then leaned back in his chair. The kitchen was so quiet we could clearly hear the knife slicing into the cutting board. May was cutting bread. I was washing dishes, my back turned toward them. Everything proceeded like a prearranged ritual. Each person knew their place and knew when to be silent. Breakfast ended without anyone touching the tea. When I turned back, the steam had dissipated, leaving a cool water line on the tabletop. Night came slowly, longer than usual. I woke up in the dead of night to check the stove, and saw a weak light spilling from the living room.
Robert was still there. He was wide awake. His eyes were red, his hands tracing the edge of the table as if searching for a memory. On the table were several loose papers, some old bills, a folded photograph. He flipped it back and forth, touching the edge of the photo, his fingernails scratching the paper with a small, steady sound. In the photo, Emery was 30 years younger, standing by a wooden truck, smiling faintly. I saw Robert's lips tremble, but not from the cold. His shadow stretched long on the wall, mixed with the lamp smoke. For a moment he turned toward the kitchen doorway, where I stood in the dark, and I thought he had seen me, but no. His gaze went right through, as if I were just an empty space. He raised a hand to his forehead, gently pressing it, as if trying to push back a memory. The wind howled outside the porch. The wooden door rattled slightly. He closed his eyes, mumbling something I couldn't quite hear. I only managed to see a single tear streak his chin, reflecting the weak yellow light of the lamp. The next morning, Anna sat on the floor with pieces of colored paper. May cut out more circles, taping them to the wall. "Do you want to tell a story?" she asked. The child nodded. "But don't be sad if I change the ending," May smiled. "Okay,
Let's try. The little girl began. Once upon a time, there was a big, cold monster. Everyone was afraid of it. But then one day, everyone stopped being afraid. They didn't run away, and they didn't cry. They just kept eating, talking, and laughing. The monster looked around, didn't see anyone trembling anymore, so it walked out into the forest, and it didn't come back. The room was silent after the last sentence. May said nothing, only stroked her hair. Anna looked up. Mom, I think the monster was tired too. It just didn't know what to do when no one was afraid of it anymore. I looked at Emery. She gently bowed her head, her lips trembling slightly, as if swallowing something bitter. That's right, she said softly. It didn't know how to live quietly. Outside, the snow was falling sporadically, no longer heavy, just a few late flakes of the season. I looked through the window and saw Robert still sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thin blanket. He wasn't smoking, wasn't holding anything, just staring at the white space in front of him. That evening, when the house was asleep, I went downstairs to pour some water. The light from inside spilled out, casting a hazy streak onto the wooden floor. I gently left the kitchen door ajar. The yellow light spread onto the porch, just enough to see a small, old silhouette curled up. Robert sat hunched over, his hands clasped between his knees. His shadow stretched long onto the yard, broken by the porch steps. He looked up at the light, then looked inside, where the clock ticked steadily. I stood still, not wanting him to know he was being watched. For a second I thought he would knock, thought he would say something or simply, "Good night." But no. He just pulled a cloth from his pocket, lightly wiped his forehead, then bowed his head. A small, tired, and very human gesture. I closed the door, leaving the light to spill out just enough to keep his shadow in shape. When I returned to the room, Emery was still awake. She sat by the bed, folding the scarf she had just sewn. Is he still on the porch? Yes, I replied, just sitting. She nodded faintly. People don't change overnight. But sometimes if they just stop causing harm, that's the beginning of change. I said nothing, only pulled the blanket up for Anna, watching the child sleep soundly, her face peaceful, as if she no longer remembered the cold, windy days of early winter. Downstairs, the yellow light still streamed from the kitchen, and I thought, perhaps Emery was right. That silence was no longer terrifying. It felt like a wound closing, slow but sure. Outside, the wind blew across the roof, sending snow drifting past the window. Thin as smoke. I heard Robert cough softly, then fall silent. In my heart, I knew. Some nights don't require an apology, only a lamp that is still lit, and a person who agrees to stay, quiet in their own coldness. The morning opened with a faint smell of burning. I went down to the kitchen and saw Robert fumbling with the old pan. The eggs were overcooked, the bread burnt black. He hunched over the stove, holding a spatula to push aside the thin layer of smoke, trying to look calm, as if this were just a minor thing that could be fixed. He set the pan down gently. No one flinched. No one said anything. Emery just opened the window to let the smoke dissipate, while Anna sat on her chair, watching him like a stranger learning how to do a familiar task. Robert shook his hand, sighing. Just a little burnt, he said quietly, then picked up the piece of bread, watching it snap in half in his hand. One half fell to the floor, landing with a dry clack. Emery didn't look at him, only said, "I'll make it again." Robert gently shook his head. "No need." His voice wasn't sharp, just tired. The kitchen was small, but that morning contained something vast, like the distance between two people who had forgotten their common language. After the incomplete meal, Robert left the table and walked toward the living room. The first light of day slanted through the door, resting on his dark coat shoulder. On the table, the old stacks of papers still lay there, things he hadn't touched in a long time. He sat down and began to open them one by one. He sifted through the old documents, pausing at the faded yellow wedding photograph. I watched from a distance, seeing him hold the photo with both hands, carefully, as if lifting something fragile. The photo was small, the silver frame worn, showing two people standing beneath a church archway. The man in the picture smiled, his lips curved, while the woman looked straight into the lens, her smile gentle as morning dew. Robert sat motionless. His hand lightly touched Emery's face in the photo, his finger tracing the fold line. The eyes in the photo no longer resembled anyone in this house. Perhaps the light had faded, or time had distorted what was once real. He tilted his head, looking so long that the sunlight shifted to his other shoulder. Then he folded the photo, placing it beside him. Not in a drawer, not hidden, just left there, like an object that could no longer keep a secret. Outside, the sound of hammering rang out steadily. I looked into the yard. Sebastian was replacing the barn door hinges. Each hammer blow was resolute, not loud, not angry. Each strike seemed to reset the rhythm of life. The cow in the barn pulled its head back, looking out, shaking gently. Robert stood on the porch, observing, saying nothing. The sunlight shone over his shoulder, illuminating the thin wisp of smoke rising from a distant chimney. "The old hinges were still usable," he said. "Maybe," Sebastian replied without looking up, "but they squeak." Robert pursed his lips. "A squeak doesn't necessarily mean broken." "But it makes it hard for others to sleep," he replied, his voice light as the wind. No one won that conversation. They were just two men speaking in the way they knew, one holding on, the other letting go. I stood by the door watching them. Perhaps for the first time there was no challenge and no fear. Just two generations trying to get used to silence as a form of agreement. Inside the house, Emery spread the curtain over the table. The fabric was old, rustling to the touch. She held the needle, threaded it, and sewed a new seam. I asked, "Can this curtain still be used?" "Of course," she smiled, the light catching her slightly cloudy eyes. "It just needs patching in the right places, to keep the wind from drafting in." I looked at her stitches, even and small. Each stitch pulled taut, then released, like a breath. I thought about how Emery once lived, silent, enduring, stitching up invisible tears for years. The only difference was that now she was sewing not to preserve but to choose her own peace. Anna ran up, pointing at the curtain. "Grandma, this color isn't pretty anymore." Emery chuckled. "Not pretty, but it still keeps the wind out. Sometimes that is enough." The child nodded, looking as if she understood. Then she picked up a scrap of fabric, taped it to the window, murmuring, "To keep the sunshine in." In the afternoon, Robert took the wedding photo out to the porch again. He sat, holding the photo, watching the light slide across the paper. No one asked what he was doing. The whole family was busy with their small tasks. May hanging blankets, Sebastian repairing the barn, Emery sewing the curtain. I washed the teapot, listening to the steady flow of water, feeling as if time itself was starting to soften. A crow cawed on the roof. Robert looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. The light reflected in his eyes, dim. Then he opened his mouth, calling softly, "Emery."
She was in the kitchen, not hearing. He called again, quieter. Emery. His voice dissolved in the wind, reaching nowhere. Robert sat for a while longer, then carefully folded the photo, slipping it into his breast pocket. His movement was slow but firm, as if, for the first time in years, he was afraid of damaging something small but real. I watched him through the window. The wind blew across the porch, carrying a few dust motes, scattering the light. Inside, Emery hung the newly sewn curtain over the window. The sunlight shone through the new stitches, casting thin golden threads. She stood for a moment, watching them sway gently, then smiled with a sense of near peace. I suddenly realized, some cracks when sewn back together in the right place don't hide the past, but simply make the light that passes through more beautiful. Out on the porch, Robert still sat. On his sleeve, threads from the new curtain had fallen, lightly clinging to the dark fabric. He didn't brush them all off, but perhaps he no longer needed to. And somewhere in the wind, I heard Anna laugh. A small, clear, and warm laugh, weaving itself into the old scents. Dusk descended. The last sunlight swept across the porch, slid onto the table, and then touched the faded yellow wedding photo peeking out from Robert's breast pocket. The image of the two young people lit up for a second, as if wanting to be seen once more, before sinking completely into the sunset. Early in the morning, the light slanted through the windowsill, cold and clear enough to see dust motes floating in the air. Robert sat motionless for a long time before moving. The clock in the living room chimed 3 times, interrupted, then fell silent. He set down his untouched teacup, his finger tapping lightly on the porcelain rim, as if marking his own rhythm. Then, slowly, Robert stood up, looked at everyone, and bowed his head, putting on his boots. No words were spoken. Emery was finishing the last stitches on her scarf. May was peeling an apple for Anna, and I was washing dishes, listening to the steady sound of running water. Everyone knew that this morning was different. Not because of the weather, but because of his gaze. Clearer, no longer demanding. He pulled on his thick coat, smoothed the sleeves once, then walked toward the door. I heard the sound of ice breaking beneath his feet. No one called out, and no one saw him off. Emery looked up. Her needle paused in midair. "Let him go," she said softly, her voice thin as breath. I nodded, not asking where he was going. Robert walked out into the yard, his steps slow but firm. His breath dissolved in layers in the cold air. Snow clung to his shoulders. The light reflected, making his hair appear stark white in the sun. His shadow stretched long on the snow, slanting, then blending into the grayish-white color of the sky and land. I stood by the door watching him. Something within me was closing, not with pain but with understanding. He walked without haste, without looking back, as if he had finally learned how to leave without needing to win. When I walked into the kitchen, the early morning light was still warm at the threshold. Emery had put away her needle and thread, washed her hands, and dried them on the old kitchen towel. The scent of tea lingered, a familiar fragrance but now devoid of the strong smell of liquor or smoke. She sat down looking at the wooden table where Robert used to sit. "There are things people only understand when they have no one left to talk to," she said, half to me, half to herself. I didn't answer. I just opened the old cupboard beneath the kitchen shelf, where seldom touched items were kept. From the old drawer I took out the yellow envelope, its edges worn. As I pulled it out, dust rose up like an old breath newly awakened. The light slanted through the window frame, illuminating the envelope, reflecting it onto the wall like a new horizon line. I gently traced the edge of the paper. The handwriting was faint, soft, the ink faded. No recipient was named, only one line written, "For a better season." I looked at Emery. She was looking toward the window, her eyes cloudy yet strangely bright, as if she knew the envelope existed, only waiting for someone calm enough to touch it.
I opened the envelope. Inside, the smell of old paper mixed with the faint scent of tea in the air. A thin folded sheet of paper stained yellow lay still as if waiting to breathe. I opened it slowly, each crease rustling softly beneath my fingertips. Inside was the letter Emery had written years ago, never sent. The writing slanted to the right, even and careful. The handwriting of someone trying to maintain composure while writing something difficult to say. If anyone reads this, I hope they know. I once loved, I just didn't know how. I held too tightly to what I was afraid to lose. I thought silence was protection, but it only pushed everyone farther away. There were days I wanted to apologize, but then I thought, an apology is for forgiveness, and I just needed someone to understand that. I tried to love in the only way I knew how. I stopped reading there. The light slowly moved across the paper, the golden streak sweeping across the words like a gentle breeze. Emery was silent, her hands clasped on the table. I wrote it that year, she said quietly. Never sent it. Maybe I was afraid. The recipient wouldn't read it. I folded the letter back up and put it in the envelope. Someone has read it now, I replied. Emery smiled. The smile wasn't wide, but enough to warm the kitchen. Some things don't need to be sent, she said. Just seeing them again is enough. Outside, the wind was gentle. The snow fell sparser, scattered on the steps, melting into small, sparkling drops in the sun. I placed the envelope back on the table. The light reflected off it, soft and steady, as if someone were wiping the dust from a part of a memory. Anna ran in, holding a drawing. Grandma, look! I drew Grandpa! Emery took it, looking at the simple drawing, an old man with white hair standing in the yard, snow around his feet. The house behind him lit up. It's beautiful, she said. But you forgot something. Anna tilted her head. Forgot what? You forgot the sky, she said, then pointed toward the window. Try adding a little yellow. Every season needs a little light. The child ran off to get a crayon, her small footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. I looked at the envelope still lying there, the light still slanting across it. Perhaps the letters that are never sent still have their own destination, as long as the reader is ready to understand. Outside, no one knew how far Robert had gone. But where he used to sit, the sunlight still shone on a small corner, warm and yellow, as if held there by an invisible hand. And in that space, I heard something. Not an apology, not a call, but only a feeling. Finally, the next season has begun. The morning opened with a pale light, no longer so cold it bit the skin. The sky was grayish silver, but the horizon was streaked with a thin band of yellow. I sat by the table, folding the letter, placing it where she usually sat sewing her scarf. The warmth still lingered in the wood. The scratch on the tabletop was still there, where the needle had once pierced, like a small memory that never left. The kitchen was quiet. Emery was outside on the porch, pruning a few dead branches, while May stoked the stove, the blue smoke drifting sideways. Anna sat on the floor, intently adding color to yesterday's drawing. The man in the yard now had a sun behind him. The wind outside the porch rose, making the paper flutter slightly, like someone taking a gentle breath. The letter partially unfolded and then closed again, its breath seeming to have its own rhythm. I gently placed my hand on it, holding it down. The paper was soft, warm, thin as the skin of someone who had lived long and hurt deeply. I held the envelope in my hand, feeling an unusual warmth, not from the tea nor the fire. It was like the warmth of someone's palm having rested there. No words needed, only presence. Outside the door, the wind swirled up a few late snowflakes. They spun, then melted instantly when they touched the ground. Winter was truly leaving, not dramatically, not abruptly, just retreating, leaving a faint trace on the porch.
I heard Emery call. May, water the plants a little. Yes, Mom. Their voices were soft, normal, but something gentle lay within every word, as if the house were relearning how to converse without fear. Robert still hadn't returned. No one asked anymore. No one was sure he would come back. But strangely, the space he left behind was no longer heavy. It was just a pause, like the rest between two pieces of music. I looked at the envelope again. The faint ink words,
For a better season, seemed brighter in the morning light. Emery walked in, carrying a bundle of dry firewood. She looked at me, then at the letter. Are you going to keep it? Just for now, I replied. Until someone needs to read it again. She nodded, smiling. Thank you. She sat down, her hand gently smoothing the tabletop, right where the envelope was lying. The day I wrote it, she said quietly. I didn't think I'd live to see another season. I thought the world would only ever be snow. I waited in silence. She looked out the window. But it seems every snow melts eventually. I didn't know what to say, only nodded. In that moment something closed between us. Not with an apology, but with truth. Perhaps this was the apology that no one had time to give. Not from the mouth, not on paper. It existed only in the way people ceased to hurt each other. Emery stood up, took the envelope and carefully placed it in the cupboard drawer, not locking it. So the wind can drop by to read it sometimes, she said. I smiled. By noon the light poured into the kitchen, flooding through the curtain Emery had just sewn yesterday. The new stitches reflected like streaks of sunlight, touching the water glass, the towel, my hand. Everything shimmered gently, not too bright, just enough to show life. May made tea, the steam rising straight up to the ceiling. Mom, she said, what if Dad comes back? Emery didn't look up. Then let him into the house, but not the kitchen. This kitchen stays quiet. May laughed, nodding. I felt that in her statement there was no hatred, only boundary and peace. Anna ran into the yard shouting, Mom, the snow's melting! We all looked. Indeed, on the ground in front of the porch, water had begun to glisten. The patches of ice broke into small streams, winding through the stones, carrying dried leaves that had been trapped since last season. Emery walked out, watching the small stream of water flow, and said, It melts slowly, but it melts for real. I asked, Are you sad? No, she replied. Just light. Everything comes to a point where it must change form. People, too. I stood beside her, listening to the tiny sound of dripping water, blended with Anna's distant laughter. The sun shone on her wrinkled hands, making her skin appear smoothly polished by time. Inside, the oil lamp still burned, even though it was no longer necessary. I didn't turn it off, because that light, weak, golden, warm, was what guided us through the longest season. As afternoon arrived, the house breathed steadily. Emery lay resting on the chair, her eyes closed, her lips faintly curved. May read a book. Anna colored the sun in bright yellow crayon. I sat by the window listening to the wind. The scent of dry wood and warm tea mingled in the air. I looked out into the yard where Robert's footprints once marked the ground. Now there was only dark, watery earth. There were no traces of the person who had just left. But I knew somewhere in the melting snow his breath still lingered, dilute, soft, like the last notes of a long-paused song. I closed my small notebook, writing one last line. Some seasons only melt when the human heart warms up. The last sunlight of the day shone onto the table, covering the yellow envelope in the drawer. The light moved slowly, then stopped, resting peacefully as a sleeping person. I took a long breath. The air smelled of dampness, wood, and the warmth of freshly brewed tea, and I understood. This winter, truly, was gone. This morning the kitchen was quiet, as if the whole house was holding its breath. On the kitchen shelf, the yellow envelope lay still, its edges frayed. The paper was porous, faded like the skin of someone who had lived long with memories. The first light of day filtered through the window, slanted, reflecting on the wall like a new horizon. It was the kind of light that winter had never possessed, not too bright, just enough to awaken the dust motes in the air.
I brewed tea, pouring 2 cups, one for myself, one for Emery, though she was still asleep. The kettle whistled evenly, softly, echoing in a kitchen that was now too familiar with silence. I sat down at the table, pulled my small notebook closer, and opened it to the very last page. The paper was slightly wrinkled, the corner stained yellow from the moisture of the cold nights. I picked up the pen and wrote slowly. I wrote to my daughter. If one day you feel fear, remember, the truth never freezes. You can be quiet but never silent. You can be weak but never turn yourself into someone else to be safe. People will tell you not to stir up old troubles, but some doors only open when you dare to touch them. And if one day you forget, look at this morning light, where everything that was once frozen begins to melt. I stopped writing, listening to a bird tapping lightly on the porch roof. Outside, the wind carried a new warmth, the damp yet gentle scent of earth about to be reborn. I gently folded the paper, cupped it in my palm, and placed the letter inside the old envelope, leaving it unsealed. The wind snuck through the door crack, making the paper flutter slightly, as if breathing. The sound was small, like the heartbeat of the house. I smiled, quietly whispering, "She will like this." On the windowsill, the oil lamp was still there, the wick burning low, the small flame tilting with the wind. I didn't extinguish it, nor did I add more oil. Sometimes the final flame doesn't need to be prolonged. It just needs to be enough to illuminate what people leave behind for each other. Outside, a small shout rang out. "Mom, the snow is melting!" Anna's voice was clear, shattering all the lingering silence. I stood up and walked to the door. The ground in front of the porch was wet, and young blades of grass trembled in the sun. On the tree branches, snow melted into drops, falling onto her shoulder, making her giggle. I bent down, stroking her hair. "See?" I said. "Just be patient a little longer. Every cold will eventually pass." Anna looked up, her eyes bright as the sun. "I know," she said, "but if the snow melts, who keeps it cold?" I laughed. "No one, because we don't need to hold on to it anymore." I took her hand and walked out into the yard. The first light of spring shone into our eyes. Young grass trembled. The air warmed up with every breath. The wind slipped through my clothes, carrying the scent of wood, tea, and the damp earth awakening. On the porch, Emery and May sat, smiling. She was wrapped in a scarf, her eyes strangely clear, while May leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. No one spoke. They just looked at each other. 2 generations who once trembled, now serene. The light touched their hair, making the silver thread shimmer like gold stitching. Emery caught my eye and nodded gently. No words needed. That nod was enough to say that everything was settled. Not perfect, but real. I turned back to look at the house. The cracks in the wooden wall, the mildew in the corner of the cabinet, everything was still there. But the house itself seemed to have changed color. Not the paint color, but the color of the air. Warm, soft, full of human presence. I quietly said, "The winter is gone, but the courage remains." The sentence rang out, small, soft, then dissolved into the spring breeze, leaving a gentle afterglow, like the last warmth of an unextinguished oil lamp. As afternoon arrived, the light slanted over the porch. Anna ran around in her new boots, picking up the stones revealed beneath the melting ice. May hung the blankets out. The smell of sun seeped into every thread of fabric. Emery stood by the window frame, holding a teacup, her gaze distant yet peaceful. I sat on the wooden step, writing the last few lines in my notebook. One cannot redo winter, but one can learn to walk through it without losing oneself. Because courage, if it was ever there,
will remain, even after the snow melts. I closed the notebook, looking at the sky slowly turning pale pink. A flock of small birds flew over the rooftop, their wings beating slowly, leaving curved trails against the clouds. Emery called softly, "Come inside, it's getting cold again." I nodded, stepping onto the wooden porch. The last light of the day touched the yellow envelope still lying on the shelf, its edge lightly shaking in the wind. I touched it gently, as if touching a memory that had been cleansed of pain. Then I extinguished the oil lamp, for the first time in months. Not because the oil had run out, but because I no longer needed it to navigate the dark. Outside, the snow was completely gone. A small stream of water flowed around the porch, carrying dried pieces of leaves from the old season. I looked out into the yard, seeing the little girl spinning with arms outstretched in the sun. With every turn, the wind lifted her hair, and I heard her laughter soar, thin, clear, free. Perhaps that was the true sound of spring, and the proof that, no matter what season comes, the courage remains. If you have ever walked through a long winter in your own home, if there were days you stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because you didn't know where to begin again, then perhaps you will understand them. These people who only needed a little light, a word left unsaid, to find the warmth they had lost. Their winter has melted, but the courage, that remains. If this story touched a small corner of your heart, please leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss other stories about family, truth, and courage.